So we're reading chapter 6 tonight, and it is on states and structures of consciousness. Basically, he goes through the states and then talks about the different levels of consciousness, both at a cultural level and also through childhood or through an individual level. He uses Piaget's structure of development and what's the other guy? John Gebster.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting that he uses both of those and kind of touches on both of them. So, do you guys have any thoughts about any of the main points?
Well, I mean, he uses both of them because one speaks about just the individual experience and the other speaks about, in a sort of deep time human history perspective.
That's right.
So, I mean, it's an interesting thing to contemplate that the same developmental stages that an individual person goes through, all of human history has gone through. And I think that notion itself is sort of obscure in our culture. But if you take even 5 minutes to step back and look at it, you're like, yeah, that's actually what's going on here.
Yeah, or even in your personal experience, right? I mean, going from a little kid all the way up to, early adulthood, and then now, where we're at in our lives, right? So there's a progression, there's a movement, and there are levels, right? And so some people are achieving those levels more quickly than others. And I mean, it'll be interesting to see in the future how many more levels get created, right? Because that's kind of the next question as well. We've discovered so many, and then what's next?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. And I like how Combs was talking about Gebser sort of conflating the integral stages, because the way he sort of described it is, he's looking up at them. So they all sort of look like they're on the same level. But
Right.
actually, just like what you were saying, you have to actually get to the level in order to sort of scope out what's actually going on here, what's at your level, below your level, and above, so you actually have to do the thing in order to start unpacking.
Yeah.
The interesting point, though, is that we think about in levels, right? And that's often how Alan Combs speaks about it, right? And how Ken Wilber often speaks about it in the form of levels, right? But I mean, that's just kind of like a metaphor, just a way to describe it. I'm just wondering, like, I mean, there's benefits of describing it that way, but there might be limitations in the sense that I think Ken Wilber and Combs think very linear, like in a kind of linear fashion. I'm just wondering if, I don't know, I've been hearing a little bit of talk around that piece about some kind of critiques about integral, about perhaps a fault in it. But I don't know, what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, for the logical mind, it does make sense. But as you say, I mean, it's interesting to start thinking about different levels in art, for instance, right? What does it look like if it's not, like an elevator going from floor to floor to floor? How else can we depict it? Like, is it, concentric rings? Is it, so yeah, I see your point, but I also see the challenge in, trying to assess something like we're doing with these stages, with the, the different parts of ourself.
Yeah, I think it's just a good question to hold, because we usually think about it as kind of a structural thing, but, perhaps there's different ways of illustrating it or conceptualizing it that might be different. That's just a good question, I think, to hold.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Blake. And the biggest deficiency I see in thinking about it like that is sort of the subtle things that come up when a person thinks of levels, because then there's, above and below and good and bad, and all these dichotomies start entering the picture. And I mean, anyone who comes to integral work for the first time, the first thing they're going to hear is transcend and include, transcend and include, transcend and include. I mean, that's like the motto for for integral. Letters to words to sentences. That's what they'll hear. So, I mean, they are in the integral community very conscious of the fact that they're nested holarchies, but then when they actually get into describing it, it's described as levels, and the sort of subtle shift I mean, you can even feel it in your head, you know, like if you say nested holarchies versus levels, there's sort of like a, you know, there's an inherent sort of charge that comes up in people's minds. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I do think it's definitely something that needs to be tidied up and like, and I mean, I'm really interested to see when visual artists start really
Yeah.
putting this stuff into their work, and you know what sort of the creative mind can come up with in terms of actually visualizing what's going on.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point is that just the debate about what might happen in postmodernism is that sometimes they consider hierarchy as in a negative sense, in a way that they think about, you know, oppressive hierarchies as opposed to growth hierarchies, and I think that's what we're trying to talk about, right? Is that there's kind of each each level embraces and includes the lower level, right? Um, and so it's not something that's just merely being, you know, oppressive or anything. It's actually showing greater care and greater love for more and more people.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
anyway,
And I mean, Combs talks about it when he speaks about the different structures of consciousness, and one of them is the actual experience. And just thinking of your sort of perspective on reality in this way that he talks about in this chapter is really eye-opening, because you know experiences, I mean, he uses the example of playing a game of poker. You know, experiences actually, you know, you're the individual sitting at the table playing the game of poker. You actually have to play in order to have the experience. But then there's these two other levels where, you know, you could be an observer on TV, or you could be sort of someone who knows the rules of the game and who's observing. So all of these different experiences of reality sort of like if you think about our own experience, you know, we're the experiencer in our whole entire sort of movie that's going on, right? And what Integral does, and what the higher stages of development do, is allow you to step back and be the person watching, you know, on TV, which is not something that most people are able to. They're not able to separate themselves from their direct experience.
Yeah, and I like, as you're saying that, Emily, you know, I have sort of an image that comes to mind, and as we're dealing with these levels, you know, it's important to not think of them as like steady bricks that we're piling on top of each other, but rather these really fluid, morphing kind of waves and spirals that are, you know, blending into each other, and it's like a really wild sort of process, right? And mysterious and full of messiness, not always just crystal clear like it shows up on the computer screen or in the book, right? With a nice, cute little diagram that's like, okay, well, this is how it is. I mean, our personal experience with life shows that it's a hell of a lot more messy than that.
and it sort of also goes back to the point about
in a beautiful way.
Goes back to the point about the last chapter that we were talking about intelligences, right? That there's different intelligences, and that, you know, perhaps we can include in a sense and get a sense of where somebody's coming from, where their perception is coming from, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the entirety of who they are. I mean, they might have structures or areas where they're lower or higher in certain areas, right? So.
Yeah, and when you put all the pieces together of the integral map, I mean, you slam them all together and you start mixing them up in a big witch's brew, you're going to see like a whole lot of, you know, what we experience in life, right? Which is ups and downs and circles and spirals and connections and movements, and so I think it's really important to keep that kind of constant fluidity in mind as we discuss these theories that, yes, can be very left brain, very logical, very abstract.
Yeah.
And you know, what I like about the end of this chapter is that Combs sort of, you know, he uses all of these developmental stages as a way to speak about worldviews, because each developmental stage births its own worldview. And, you know, even more than in the last chapter, when we're just speaking about a person's experience of reality, this chapter sort of brings it out into the broader context and makes it clear as to why these things are important, because, you know, just as you were saying, Blake, before about the ability to hold more of reality in sort of loving care, you know, I mean, war is the direct result of not being able to do that, you know, and he sort of steps up the sort of ladder of escalations that happen at lower stages of development, or when two stages of development are clashing against each other, who sort of think that they hold a singular viewpoint. And I mean, it really just drives home the point as to why this is important. It's because it's having an actual effect on our, not only our individual lived experience, but I mean, in the entirety of what's going on. Yeah, I mean, it's just astounding.
And it was interesting though to see.